Hello, I'm Derek Osborne, the Asia coordinator for Prepare International, and I'm here to do a short YouTube video on something that I've been studying and thinking about often. It's so exciting and grateful to be here with you today, sharing with you during this kind of uncertain time. But as I've been doing some research and thinking about this word obedience, there are lots of scriptures about obedience. There are many stories we could go to and draw from, but I'd like to focus on one. In 1 Samuel 15, we have a king, his first king of Israel, King Saul, who was asked by a prophet to go defeat and kill Amalek and his armies and all the livestock, everything to just be slaughtered. And so when Saul went to defeat them, he didn't kill everyone. He defeated them, but then he paraded them in a parade. He brought all of them back and said to Samuel that he was going to provide God with a good sacrifice because of what he had done, and he defeated what God had told him to do. And Samuel got upset and he said, God told you to do something specific and you did not do it. And Saul began to make excuses for his disobedience. And he said, after that, Samuel told Saul that God needs his obedience. It's better to be obedient than to have a sacrifice. That's in verse 22. And as I began to think about that, and in my life, unfortunately, I take a lot of pride in sacrificing for God or sacrificing for my wife or my children, friends, or whoever. And why? Because I believe because sacrifice is very visible. Just as in the Old Testament it was, you could not get wood, you could not build a fire, you could not sacrifice an animal without people seeing the smoke or smelling what was going on. And so even today when we sacrifice, others can see it and they can also appreciate it, which is something good and biblical. But when sacrifice doesn't come from obedience, then it's in vain. So sacrifice makes me look good to others. I think that's why we tend to like it so much. But when I look at this passage, I realize that God most of the time isn't looking for my sacrifice. He's looking for my obedience. You see, God wants to know if I'm obedient first and foremost. Then after he sees my obedience, he will ask for a sacrifice. A lot of time God is looking for those who will be obedient in times of crisis and uncertainty more than those who will display a sacrifice in times of crisis and uncertainty. And how do we know this? Because he's proven this principle with other people before. If we look at the life of Jesus, we see that, when we're preaching, when we're teaching, we should always focus on the cross. But we have to realize and never forget why Jesus was chosen to go to the cross. Is because of his obedience to God. Obedience always leads to sacrifice, never the other way around. Only when we're obedient does God want our sacrifice. So as I grow, as I struggle with this thing of obedience versus disobedience, I see that how can I sacrifice so that others can see how obedient to God that I've been? Oftentimes we fall into this trap of disobedient sacrifice and wonder why God did not bless what I was doing. You see, obedience is something that's done in the dark. It's done in the mundane. It's done in the secret. And when we do this first, then God will allow us to move into the light where others can see what God has done inside of us, and he will allow us the opportunity to go and dive into a sacrifice. Here's my question. How are you being obedient to God? How are you being obedient with your time? How are you being diligent in what God is asking from you? How are you, and on the flip side of that coin, how are we placing too much importance on the sacrifice and not enough importance on obedience to God? You see, Saul knew what God was asking him to do. He knew that God wanted him to kill everybody and everything. But then in that process of trying maybe to be obedient, he saw an opportunity for others to look at him in a new light. Maybe a great king. Maybe, wow, look what Saul can do. So Saul took it upon himself to bring God a sacrifice. And because of that, Saul decided upon himself to bring God a sacrifice instead of being obedient. And that caused all kinds of problems for Saul. Because here's the interesting thing about that story. Samuel got upset with what Saul was doing, and Saul was upset with Samuel the prophet. So Samuel walked away from Saul. And at that moment, Saul grabbed Samuel's cloak and it ripped. And Samuel looked back at Saul and said, just as you ripped my cloak, God is going to rip the kingdom from you because of his disobedience. It's a big deal to be obedient to God, and we say that a lot. We've heard it many times. I've heard it since I was a little child, but how that plays out in our life is when we totally saturate ourselves in what God wants from us, which is difficult, which is almost impossible some days. But when we spend time in his word, when we spend time in prayer, when we spend time being obedient to the things God has for us, then that sacrifice will flow very easily out of our lives. I hope you have a good day. I'll be praying for all of you, and we'll see you next time.